Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I'm Aaron, and this is the Inclusive Dad podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in exploring ways we can create a more inclusive world together. You are important, you matter, and you can make a difference. Today, my guest is Dr. V. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't you just start us off by telling me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Victoria Mattingly, but people call me Dr. V. I'm CEO and founder of Mattingly Solutions. We're a workplace inclusion consulting firm. My background is in organizational psychology, so bringing more scientific rigor and data into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space is where I've been focusing my efforts for the last 8 years. I talk a lot about inclusive behaviors, allyship. I give a lot of keynote speeches. I'm the author of the book Inclusalytics, which is all about data-driven diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my forthcoming book, all about allyship, is coming out in August.
That's great. What is your definition of inclusion?
Inclusion are the behaviors that result in others feeling valued, respected, seen, and heard. So inclusion is what we do, and then belonging is the outcome. So the thing that's a little tricky about it is what might make someone feel included or that they belong could look different for another person. And so it's our responsibility as humans and coworkers and leaders to learn what makes people feel valued, respected, seen, and heard, and treating them as such.
That's great. So with that definition, is there kind of one policy a company can have to make everybody feel included? Or to me, it seems like you're saying it's more of you need to get to know everybody and kind of find out individually what makes them, how they're included and how they feel like they're belonging.
I think if we start with respect, so how can we make sure that people feel respected in the workplace? Sure. So respect means making sure people feel like their voices are being heard, that their work is being valued. Respect means, being seen for who you want to be seen as. Respect is making sure you get someone's name right or their pronouns right. So I think if we start with respect, that's a really great place to get started. When it comes to organizations and measurement particularly, I always say inclusion should never be a self-report item. So you should never say, how inclusive do you believe you are on a scale of 1 to 5? Like that doesn't make sense. How we need to measure inclusion is by other reports. So my peers treat me this way. My leaders treat me this way. My subordinates treat me this way. My clients treat me this way. And that way we're getting a more accurate measure of how people feel like they are valued, respected, seen, and heard through the behaviors of others.
Sure. So how did you get into this area of work?
So I got my PhD I started my program back in 2012, and I began looking at how can we train the world to be more emotionally intelligent? So what are the best practices of training and development when it comes to what people call soft skills? I like to call them power skills because it's really how you get stuff done as a leader in an organization is by having high emotional intelligence, empathy, communication skills, all that. And then I had an internship in 2016 where I started working on their women in leadership practice. It was a leadership development consulting firm. And I noticed, intuitively, all the content was directed for women, about women, what women should do. But if you look at most organizational hierarchies, the higher you go up, the less and less women there are. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, if we don't get men actively involved in these efforts, we're never going to make the type of progress we can make otherwise. And so I proposed building a training called Men as Allies, which then ended up being the foundation of my dissertation work. That allyship training is still a product that company sells to this day. Really cool. But that's really what got me into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space was male allyship. And I've since grown out that definition of allyship to be a lot more intersectional because there can be allies for any marginalized or underrepresented group, not just women.
Yeah. So maybe do you want to share how do you define allyship and what makes your definition different than other conceptualizations of allyship?
Absolutely. So allyship is defined as the ongoing relationship between an ally and the individual or group they're trying to serve for the shared goal of inclusion and fairness. And so what makes my definition more unique than other definitions out there is that it brings in the perspective and the critical role of what I call the partner, so the recipient of allyship. It definitely needs to be viewed as a dyadic relationship. So one should never ally alone. Ally is a verb. It's not a noun. It's not who you are. It's what you do. But you should never do that work in isolation. You should always work in partnership with the individual or group that you're trying to serve. And so I'm really excited with my forthcoming book, because it's actually 2 books in one. So one side is for the ally. If you flip it over, the other side is for the partner. And the books then reference each other. So I'll say on the partner book, hey, I'm telling allies on page A42 to be courageous. So give them something courageous to do. And then I want them to be like, what's on A42, and flip it over, because the conclusion of both books is that allyship is fluid. And I think a lot about my former business partner, who's a Black woman, and people look at us and they just assume I, as the white woman, am the ally. But Certrice has been my motherhood ally, my mental health ally, my grievance ally when my father passed away. She's been my ally in so many other situations. And then I, of course, try to be her racial ally when I can. But it's that other perspective. It really hasn't been addressed. And I'm excited as I continue my research to figure out what are those key partner behaviors that partners can do to maximize the effectiveness of allyship relationships.
Yeah. Can you maybe define what you mean when you're saying the word ally, just so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, an ally is someone who uses their power, privilege, and status to advocate for and support individuals who are different than them in some meaningful way. So, for example, if there was another white, cis, straight, middle-aged woman, she could be my mentor, my sponsor, my advocate, my champion, but she would not be my ally, because we are one and the same. It's the same way if you think about like socio-political allyship. Like America wouldn't be its own ally to itself, right? You need to be a different country. And that difference part is really important to allyship, because research shows that unconscious bias, we can't get rid of it by going to unconscious bias training. Like, we can learn about it, we can be aware of it, but it's unconscious. The one strategy that actually reduces our biases against others is by having meaningful interactions with individuals that belong to the groups that we hold biases against. So that's my kind of hidden agenda with allyship, is I want to get people interacting and creating meaningful relationships across their differences to start mitigating those biases that we have unconsciously.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you want to talk, maybe, I saw your Disrupt HR talk that you shared, that you just recently did, and at the beginning of it, you ripped off your wig and threw it into the crowd, or threw it somewhere. Do you want to talk about your that part of you, that you have the visible difference that you embrace?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year, I lost my hair to alopecia. And I've been navigating, particularly in the workplace, how to present myself, especially as a woman. There's a lot tied up in a woman's identity and her hair and femininity and, just looks. Yeah. And so I've been experimenting with using different wigs. Today I have a head wrap on. Sometimes I'll go fully bald, not as often. I like to be really freshly shaved, because I still have a little bit of hair. Sure. So I like to get the straight razor shave the days that I go fully bald. But it got me thinking about how diversity and inclusion is so much more than just gender and race. And I feel like that's where the conversation tends to get stuck here in the States, especially. So there's so much more to DEI, because it's essentially how can we manage and work through our differences in the workplace, and being a bald woman makes me different in the workplace. And so in that talk, I wanted to start off by stripping off my wig. I threw it to my husband in the audience because it's an expensive wig, so I didn't want to just throw it on the floor.
Right.
And I talked about some best pointers, best practices for visible differences in the workplace, being accepting, being curious, asking for consent before you ask questions. Like, hey, is it okay if I ask about, your alopecia, your wig? And just not making people feel othered. So one key example from my talk is it makes me feel weird when someone's like, oh, that's a nice wig, because it makes me feel like I'm different, like I'm unusual, I'm abnormal.
Right.
When they say, I love your hair, I love that. I love when people say, I love your hair, because it is my hair. It just happens to also be a wig, right? But it's on my head, it's my hair. And, it makes me feel more accepted and in the in group.
Yeah, when I was watching that, one of the stats I think you shared was that by 50% of men will have lost their hair, but it's 25% of women. Did I get that right?
Yep.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, obviously I'm bald. My grandpa on my mom's side and my dad were both bald, so I pretty much was going to be bald, I feel like. But just, it's interesting. Because when you were just talking there, I was thinking, like, usually, I mean, if I see a woman that doesn't have hair has a wig, especially if she's white, I kind of assume maybe she had cancer or something like that. Whereas African American, I mean, they sometimes they'll wear wigs or do different things with their hair more often. I feel like, I don't know if that's actually right or not, but just it's kind of interesting how your perception of seeing a woman without, with a wig on or without hair, like what my brain goes to. Interesting.
Yeah. And that's been a concern of mine, because I actually did have cancer a few years ago. I didn't lose my hair during that. And so I don't want people to think that I have cancer. So I try to talk about it when I can. And also, you're correct that wig wearing is a lot more predominant in the Black community. The wig store that I shop at in Pittsburgh, it's definitely tailored for Black women. And so I had to do some soul searching. Am I appropriating a culture that isn't mine by wearing wigs? Talking to some of my Black friends, be like, is this appropriate? And came to the conclusion that this is just the beauty of diversity. By me, reaching out to the Black community and exploring what resources are in that community, I'm able to access more wigs and more options for how I present myself. And so that's what diversity is all about, is how can we become better people because we're interacting with people who are different than us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Interesting. What does true allyship look like in the workplace, and how is it different from simply having good intentions?
So allyship means action. It's really not, it's not who you are. It's not your intentions. It's what you actively do. I always say you should never call yourself an ally. I like to say phrases like, I'm trying to be a better ally, or I'm trying to work on allyship, or work on acting like an ally. But I never say I am an ally. I always say, let someone else give you that designation, and that's how you know you're doing it right. So in the workplace, allyship, at its core is supporting and advocating for underrepresented or marginalized groups. So that could look a wide variety of different ways. On the individual level, it could involve a lot of mentoring or sponsoring. And whereas mentoring is, having discussions, and it's a lot of behind closed doors, one-on-one guidance and support. Sponsorship is really where, the rubber hits the road when it comes to helping someone advance in the workplace. So you sponsor someone by, saying their name and their accolades when they're not in the room, bringing them into networking events, giving them opportunities that they wouldn't have had otherwise, really leveraging your status as a leader in an organization to pull someone up in that organization. So that's a really powerful ally behavior. Another ally behavior in the workplace is amplification. representation. So say there's a woman in a room, she's the only woman in a meeting, she says an idea, no one acknowledges it. 5 minutes later, a man in the room says the same idea, he gets the credit. So an ally could jump in and amplify that woman and say, hey, yeah, Kate was the one that said that idea 5 minutes ago. Let's let her elaborate on that and share some examples, right? So you're amplifying voices that are otherwise being unheard. And then a final common strategy for allies in the workplace is centering others. So allies have to be humble and not make it about them. So how can we make sure that we're centering those who are underrepresented, those who are marginalized, we're making it about them, we're focusing the problem, the issue, the product build on the most marginalized individuals to make sure that the solutions, that the direction, that the decisions being made are focusing on those underrepresented or marginalized groups.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, obviously, a lot of my stuff revolves around inclusion for people with disabilities because I have a daughter, Cecilia. She's 22, and uses a wheelchair to get around. So just a lot of my stuff is a lot of accessibility things where we go to see somebody playing music at a bar and it's not accessible, or different things are not accessible. Would it be allyship? Like if I'm working at a company and there's nobody else with a wheelchair, but I'm like bringing up, hey, we need to make sure that our facility is accessible. Is that considered allyship, or would that be kind of something different?
Oh, absolutely. Because as I mentioned earlier, the goal of allyship is to, have a fair and inclusive world, especially for those from marginalized or underrepresented groups. So advocating for better accessibility as someone who doesn't necessarily need it themselves, that is certainly an allyship behavior. Now, to make it true allyship, I would then recommend partnering with someone who has disabilities to make sure that the solutions being built are being centered on someone who has that lived experience. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that is a great point. I mean, I've been asked to serve on a couple committees, accessibility committees, and I'm honored to do that because of my experience with my daughter. But then getting there and looking around the table, and there is not very many people with visible disabilities at the table. I mean, I brought up a couple times like, hey, we need to find some people who use wheelchairs or, those kind of different things to have them on the committee, because, I mean, they should be the ones telling us, does what the ADA says in their measurements, is that, even work at this point anymore, or do we need something? Is it better to have more? We need them at the table. So that's a great point that I can help with the conversation, but we need to have people with, in wheelchairs, or in my case with disabilities, at the table, talking to them too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How can organizations create a culture where allyship is not just encouraged, but expected and rewarded?
Well, what gets measured gets done. So I was working with a Fortune 10 client a few years ago, and we were building out their global allyship program. And I was adamant that the measurement of success needs to come from the recipients of the allyship. And so there's a lot of programs out there that have reporting systems where people can submit if they're being discriminated against, or and I was like, what if we would use these reporting systems instead of calling out discrimination, we're calling out cases of allyship and how someone has been served by an ally in whatever way. And so have that be the measure of success. And so to answer your question, maybe having leaders have at least 3 or 5, reports of allyship per year, right? And if they don't get their allyship reports, then they don't get their full bonus, right? That's really, where the rubber hits the road when it comes to making things happen in organizations. And so measuring allyship in a valid and reliable way, and then tying that measurement to end of year reports, promotions, bonuses. I think that's really how we can make it a culture of allyship and not just good intentions or just the very few people who are passionate about workplace inclusion and justice doing this work.
Yeah. This year, with all the negative things being said about DEI, what's been your experience as far as people reaching out or companies and how they're handling DEI in this environment?
So some companies are abandoning it altogether, but those companies, in my opinion, were never doing it for the right reasons in the first place. Everyone jumped on the bandwagon in 2020 and 2021. And so those that are jumping off now never had the right, intentions in the first place. So the ones that were doing it for the right reasons, and those right reasons are business case, like getting DEI right is better for the organization. You keep people around longer. You attract more top talent. You better serve your customers. You have brand loyalty, people who, have values alignment with DEI. Think about what Target did. They just lost so much in sales the last few months because they bowed out of their DEI programming. So the organizations that are still doing it, what I'm seeing is that they're doing it a lot more quietly than they used to. So we're not seeing the big annual reports and the PR, campaigns and all that. But it's still being done just more quietly. And it's being done under a different name. So a lot of my clients are moving more away from DEI, more towards belonging, culture and engagement, people and empowerment. But if you look under the hood, the work being done is still the type of DEI work that was being done a few years ago under that name.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I started my podcast like last year, and using the word inclusion, I have inclusion tattooed on my arm, and all this stuff starts happening. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't really change a tattoo on my arm, but do I need to change the words I'm using? But it's an interesting time we're in right now.
Even myself, I've rebranded myself, even though Mattingly Solutions is certainly a DEI consulting firm. I've specialized in DEI for the last 8 years, but now I talk about it in terms of workplace inclusion and allyship, which still feels authentic and true to me. But I've really stayed away from the term DEI lately because it's just been so villainized and appropriated by those who don't understand what it means and think it actually means exclusion and discrimination, which is just so up is down and right is left to me.
For sure. Absolutely. What is the role of the recipient of allyship in the workplace?
So there's 3 characteristics of partners that I talk about in my book. The first is self-awareness. So if an ally comes to you and says, how can I help you? How can I support you? To be able to answer that question, you need self-awareness for what are the challenges that you're facing? What do you want out of your career? Or what are your goals? If it's outside work situation. So self-awareness is the first. The second is trusting. So a lot of people don't want to work with allies because they don't necessarily trust that individual from that particular group. Now, while trust does need to be earned, I have a whole chapter for allies on how to earn trust, right? You can't just give blindly. But if you do enter an ally partnership with an ally, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, letting them make mistakes as long as they correct those mistakes moving forward. Having that trust is really important to be able to have the necessary conversations and vulnerability to do allyship right. And the third is being action oriented. So if an ally is able to get you some, opportunity or some new position, being able to then step up into that role and jump into that opportunity and deliver. I remember one of my allies said to me years ago, he's like, the only reason I'm putting so much time into you is because you actually deliver on it. You actually follow through with the things we talk about. And I get, that reward of seeing how our allyship is helping you advance, right? And so partners need to have that action orientation to get that work accomplished. It doesn't all fall on the ally. Yeah,
that's great. So how did you come up with the idea of having the book be the front and the back, 2 different books instead of having 2 separate books? I'll release this one now, and then 6 months or later I'll send it or release the second one.
Yeah, so I really wanted to viscerally represent the core premise of the book, which is that allyship is a two-way relationship between an ally and a partner. So having both sides, you're able to see from both perspectives. And when you get into the middle of the book, it's actually the end of both books, and it's going to say they just might end up being an ally to you. You flip it over, you just might end up being an ally to them. And so the end of the book kind of invites you to then read the other side of the book, because as I mentioned before, allyship's a fluid concept. It depends on who's in the position of power, status, privilege, in that context. And so it's important to actually know both sides of allyship. So that's why I didn't want the books to be separate, because I didn't want it to come across as you just need to know one side or the other. You really need to know both.
Yeah, I love
and
that.
It's fun. It's fun. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure sort of situation, because you can go back and forth between the books. And I want to market it with 2 bookmarks. So you can have one bookmark for the partner book, one bookmark for the ally book. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. How can we use empathy to be more inclusive?
So empathy is really getting into someone's mindset, someone's feelings, where they're at. And it's a tool for connection. Going back to my definition of allyship, making someone feel valued, respected, seen, and heard, I really think empathy really exemplifies the seen and heard portion, because empathy, you're able to really identify with what someone's going through, be able to sit with them. You see them for who they truly are. You're hearing, what they're saying. And so you're able to really make someone feel seen and heard if you get empathy right.
Yeah, great. What is one tip that you can share to help the listeners be more inclusive today? Just something everybody can start doing today to be more inclusive.
I think actively listening. I think we're really good at listening to respond, right? But if we can actively listen to what someone's saying, we can learn about who they are, their authentic selves, what are the things that we can do to make them feel valued, respected, seen, and heard. You'll never learn that if you don't actively listen and ask, good questions to someone to really understand who they are, so then you can treat them the way that they want to be treated.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to share where the best place is for everybody to connect with you, and again, when your book's going to come out and those details?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to mattinglysolutions.com/allyship, that's the landing page for the book. Also, that's my website. So you can contact me directly from mattinglysolutions.com. And I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So you can find me as Victoria Mattingly, PhD. Dr. V's in there too. So it's V Mattingly. That's my LinkedIn handle. So please connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to continue the conversation about allyship and inclusion.
Absolutely. Ready for the last question?
Yes.
You like spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
No.
No. No, that was I got it. So I live by Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam and where the spam museum's located. So I've been asking all my guests as kind of fun questions to see what people's answers are, and it's usually a fast yes, fast no, or I haven't eaten it. That's kind of the 3 options. There's not like I don't know. So, yeah.
That's the most random podcast question I've ever been asked. You win the prize.
There we go. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. To those listening, thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. It is truly an honor. Please join the podcast newsletter by clicking on the link in the episode description to keep up with the latest episodes. Together we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.